Okay, good evening and welcome everybody. To those who are returning, welcome back. To those who are here for the first time, welcome along. And I'm delighted we can have this session together. So thank you very much for joining. Tonight's session is entitled Journeys to the Land of Israel. And I think there is some amazing stuff to say about this, which we'll cover during our time together. As previously, please do refer to the instructions in the email sent to you for how to log your attendance via SurveyMonkey. And later on in the broadcast, I'll give some more details of how to do that. And if you've got any particular questions or comments that you'd like to make about the materials, like to ask anything, please put them in the comments. And one of my colleagues who are very kindly monitoring the Zoom broadcast will send this to me. Now, I want to look at the idea of journeys to the land of Israel in two ways. One is as a reality, but the other is as a concept. Because if one looks through Jewish history, I think both of these streams apply. Let's go back to the first journey to the land of Israel, which of course was that of Abraham and Sarah. In the chapter 12 of the Torah, and chapter 12 of Genesis, of the book of Bereshit in Hebrew, Abraham very famously is commanded by God to go from his birthplace to a place that God will show, which is the land of Canaan, which of course today we call the land of Israel. So Abraham went, and what kind of character is Abraham when he does this? How do we understand Abraham and Sarah when they make this particular journey? They are the people, the rabbis of the Midrash. The Midrash is rabbinic teachings about what the real messages are from the Torah, about the way that we live. The messages from the Bible about the way that we live. Rabbis who lived 1,800 years ago. And they portray Abraham and Sarah, as people that were bringing monotheism to the world. So their journey to the land of Israel wasn't just a reality, but it was a way of demonstrating monotheism to the world, that they were going because God had commanded them to go. And when they went to the land of Israel, a land which we understand from the Torah, God, so to speak, has his eyes especially focused on, a place of a greater dwelling of God's presence. This was part of Abraham and Sarah's bringing of monotheism to the world. So therefore, the traveling to the land of Israel was not just a physical journey for them, but it was something conceptual. That by going to the land of Israel, you are showing your connection to God. You are going on a journey, you are extending yourself, going beyond yourself to somehow draw closer to God and make the effort to do so. And I think if we look at going to the land of Israel in this way, both physically, the journeys that Jews have made to Israel, but also conceptually, I think we can discover something which is, I think, not just of great interest, but of great relevance to us as well, wherever a person might be at any particular time. And I'll explain more about that later on. And of course, the next great journey to the land of Israel was of the Jewish people when they left Egypt, the Exodus. And that journey, of course, wasn't a simple or straightforward one, as you know. Now, we were meant to go directly via Mount Sinai to the land of Israel, but instead, because of various problems on the way, which the Torah talks about, notably the sin of the spies, as recounted in the book of Numbers, the book of Bamidbar, we instead spent 40 years in the desert. And the number 40 is, I think, an important one here as well, because there are other journeys in Jewish life which took which linked to the number 40. Take, for instance, Noah and his ark, the flood for 40 days. Take, for instance, Moses on Mount Sinai for periods of 40 days. And then a journey from Egypt to the land of Israel, a journey which went from the idolatry and the problems of Egypt to the promised land of Israel, a place of greater religious sensitivity and connection to God. And this was a journey that took 40 years. And funnily enough, we're in the middle of another 40 period at the moment, which is from the beginning of the month of Elul, which in the Jewish calendar precedes the month of Tishrei, our current month. And of course, from the beginning of the month of Elul until the 10th of Tishrei, which is Yom Kippur, is a period of 40 days. So there's another journey, so to speak, which we go on from the beginning of the month of Elul, which is a time of repentance, a time of people evaluating themselves and trying to improve themselves, which of course culminates on Yom Kippur. So you can see all these links conceptually and physically in the journeys we make to the land of Israel. And this also works with other great journeys in the Bible, be it that of the Jewish people under the leadership of Joshua crossing the River Jordan into the land of Israel, or at the time of the construction of the Second Temple, Ezra and Nehemiah, all these great biblical epic stories of the people coming to the land of Israel. And this is a story which has been repeated by Jews throughout the ages, coming to the land of Israel. I even remember as a child, maybe some of you had a similar experience, my grandmother's first visit in her 80s to the land of Israel, to the state of Israel. My grandmother was born in Limerick, early on in Ireland, early on in the 20th century, not long after the pogrom against Jews in Limerick, the only pogrom against Jews ever in Ireland. And for years she'd wanted to go to Israel but couldn't. And in her late 80s, finally managed to make that journey. And her sense of, I can't even describe it properly, her sense of gratitude and her sense of amazement to be in Israel was wonderful. And this was just a regular, if I can put it this way, she described herself as just a regular Jewish woman who was living in London at the time. And her sense of pride when her grandchildren were able to study and live in the land of Israel. I mean, this was for her the culmination of a dream. Quite remarkable. So these are, I'm sure you have similar experiences perhaps amongst your family or people that you know. So the idea of traveling and journeys to the land of Israel is a really important one, which has inspired and fired up the Jewish people throughout the generations for centuries, really. So using this prism of reality and concept, I want to look at a number of important journeys which have taken us to the land of Israel. The first one I want to start with is one which one of my neighbor's mothers went on. And this is the journey of Iraqi and Iranian Jews to Israel in 1948 to 1949. And this is a quite remarkable story. If you're not aware of it and you're interested in these things, it's definitely worth finding out more about it. Let me just give you a taste of what my neighbor's mother went through. Her family came from Mashhad in Iran. There was a sizable Jewish population. And they were able to eventually escape via Iran, via Iraq, after spending time hiding in both countries, and go on clandestine flights organized by the Jewish Agency through an operation called Ezra and Nehemiah, named after those biblical figures that I mentioned before, who also led the Jews back to Israel from that part of the world. And this meant her leaving home in the middle of the night, crossing borders, hiding in buildings for 3 or 4 months, until eventually, at the age of 11, she was reunited with her family, who managed to escape to Tel Aviv. And she became one of the first air staff on El Al. She was on the first El Al flight, working as one of the staff on the flight. And what was that flight doing? It was bringing other Jews to the land of Israel as well. It's a really, really remarkable story. And these were people who, to get to the land of Israel and to stay there, lived in what were called the Ma'abarot, transition camps at the time, which meant effectively living for extended period of time, for some years, in tents and then tin huts, which is no fun, until eventually they were able to move into proper buildings. And all this going on at a time when the population of the state of Israel at its independence was a Jewish population, was approximately 650,000. It was surrounded by countries trying to attack it and even destroy it. And at the same time was absorbing as many immigrants as it physically could. It's just absolutely remarkable. Why did this happen? Because in the heart of the Jewish people, there's the concept of the land of Israel being special for us, a place we are always journeying to because it's a place that represents a better future, the visions and the blessings of the Bible, and a place to which we've always been committed, wherever we have been, committed to getting there physically if we can, but always as a concept in our hearts. That's why it's mentioned every day in our prayers, about the idea of the special nature of the land of Israel in the second paragraph of the Shema, for instance, and our prayers to God to restore us to Zion, to take us back to the land of Israel, to let us be able to journey there. And this is, of course, what fired the imagination of the Zionist movement, particularly the religious Zionist movement, but not the religious Zionist movement alone, Zionism in general, that somehow we could build a better society based on the teachings of the Torah in the land of Israel. Now, another story which I think relates very strongly to this is one which I read in the biography, the autobiography of a very fascinating figure who unfortunately passed away a number of years ago, but called Yehuda Amital. sorry, Yehuda Avner, excuse me. Yehuda Avner was born in Manchester, and he became an assistant to a number of prime ministers of the state of Israel, as well as an ambassador and serving other diplomatic roles. And he wrote a fascinating autobiography called The Prime Ministers. And this is a journey of someone from Manchester. I don't know, maybe some of you from Manchester watching here. It's at the age of 17, before the declaration of the state of Israel, moved to Israel to study, stayed, and had these experiences. It's a quite remarkable, absorbing read. Again, if you find these things interesting, one of my colleagues is, by his own admission, not a great reader. He picked up this book. He said he read it all day. He couldn't put it down. And in this book, Yehuda Avner tells us something quite remarkable. We were able to publish the excerpts in this book over here. This is a publication of the United Synagogue and Tribes some years ago. It's a prayer book for the modern days of the Jewish calendar. Yom HaZikaron, Israel's Memorial Day. Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel's Independence Day. Yom HaShoah, Israel's Holocaust Memorial Day. And Yom Yerushalayim, celebrating Jews being able to go to Jerusalem and Israel getting control of Jerusalem in the Six-Day War. And it's a book not just which has prayers, but it has essays in and illustrations, such as over here. And the essays and the illustrations talk about the meanings of Israel as related to the prayers. So it's not just a commentary on the prayers, it's relating our prayers to these 4 days in particular. And on this page over here, I don't know how clearly you can see it, the picture is of Golda Meir. Golda Meir, of course, was Israel's prime minister in 1973 during the Yom Kippur War. And she is sitting with troops on the Golan Heights at this particular time. And Golda Meir noted that in this book, which Yehuda Avner wrote, he was with her at the time, she noted a very important formative experience in her life, which relates to journeys to the land of Israel. And I'd like to share it briefly with you. Some of you may know that the tank battles in the Yom Kippur War in the Golan Heights were really very brutal and very, very difficult. In fact, there was even one battle which is called the Veil of Tears, because that is exactly what it was. And at one stage in the respite of that battle, Golda Meir, visiting the troops, as we saw in that picture, was asked a very difficult question. Why are we doing this? So you can imagine the scene. These troops, some of them in their early 20s, some of them a little bit older, were asking this kind of grandmother figure in her 70s, why are we doing this? And Golda Meir explained why she thought we were. She said in 1948, she had been appointed Israel's first ambassador to the Soviet Union. You can imagine that that was quite a position. She arrived in Moscow not long before Rosh Hashanah, this time of the year, and she figured, even though she wasn't particularly observant, but as Israel's ambassador, she has to go to synagogue, she has to go to shul. And that's what Israeli diplomats should do. So she mentioned this to her staff and said, we're all going to go to the synagogue on Rosh Hashanah. And she actually went the week before to see how things were. And she noted that in the synagogue, there weren't very many people. You can imagine that going to a synagogue in 1948 in Stalinist Soviet Union was not an easy or even a safe thing to do. However, news of her attendance spread pretty quickly. And the week afterwards, when she went on Rosh Hashanah, she could barely get anywhere near it, because not only the synagogue was full, but the streets around the synagogue were full. I mean, just imagine this, it's Stalinist Russia. The Gulag is in full operation. And the estimate was that 50,000 Jews, some of them even in Red Army uniforms, crowded the streets because they heard the Israeli ambassador was coming. A state of Israel had been declared, with, of course, the support of the Soviet Union in strategic terms, even if not in ideological terms. And people just wanted to come to get a glimpse of the ambassador to the Soviet Union. If you can see this picture over here, this is a picture of the people thronging around Golda Meir. You might be able to see it's a very old picture, and we were just about able to include it in the book. The resolution was just about good enough. You can see possibly Golda Meir circled in the crowd. This was her trying to get to shul, and she writes that when she got there, people came up to her and just wanted to hold her hand, and they said, "Shana Tova Golda, mir danken Medinas Yisrael." In Yiddish, they said, "Thank you for the state of Israel." And Golda Meir said, by her own admission, as I mentioned, she wasn't a religious person, but she was so swept up with the emotion of the moment. She said she prayed like she had never prayed in her life, because she felt a responsibility to the Jews of Russia. She felt she was representing the concept and the reality of the land and the state of Israel. And she said she'd never been so moved in her life. So turning to those soldiers, she said, this is why we're doing it. And I tell this story with a lot of humility. I can't really tell it properly because I wasn't there. Thank God I've never been in any situation like that. But this, for Golda Meir, was a very powerful experience, and it made a tremendous impression on those soldiers there who were going through the most awful of times. So journeys to the land of Israel and representing the concept of the land of Israel are a critical part of what it means to be Jewish. One of the great Jewish figures of the 18th century was Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, one of the early Hasidic figures. And he was famous for his saying, I'll say it in Hebrew because it really resonates, especially for those of you that understand Hebrew, and then I'll translate it. Kol makom she'ani holech le'eretz Yisrael. That every place I am going to, I'm going to the land of Israel. This was long before political or any other form of Zionism. But I think what Rabbi Nachman meant by that was that the state of Israel, the land of Israel, excuse me, is a place which, as I mentioned, represents the biblical blessings of the Jewish people. It represents a better future, but it also represents our aspirations for what we can do there if we are able to live the Torah and observe the Torah in full in the lands where God's presence is even more apparent. And so therefore, for Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, even if he couldn't get physically anywhere near the land of Israel, nonetheless, the concept of what it meant was really significant, of somehow representing the land of Israel and what he did and the way that he lived his life, and always feeling that connection to it. Now, I mentioned in a previous session the words of Menachem Begin, the former Israeli prime minister, that he was born in Jerusalem, he put it, but his mother happened to be in Lithuania at the time. Okay, and I mean, as we said on that occasion, that wherever a Jew is somehow is located, they are nonetheless domiciled in a spiritual sense in the land of Israel, excuse me, if they wish to be so, and they wish to do so. So the teaching of Rabbi Nachman, I think, is a beautiful one, because it says that the concept of traveling to the land of Israel is one you can do even if you can't get anywhere physically near it, such is the case, unfortunately, for many people at the moment. I want to share one other particular journey, one special journey with you about traveling to the land of Israel. And this is one you may have seen in this book, which we mentioned last week, the Shana Tova book, which is a book the United Synagogue in Koren publishes in Jerusalem, published a few weeks ago for this time of year, for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, particularly for those who are unable to get to services. And it's some reading and other material in it, but it's also a companion to the Machzor, to the festival prayer book, and has, I think, some beautiful things in it. Here's an example of one page with some articles written by Sivan Rahav Meir, the well-known Israeli broadcaster and educator. But we were also very fortunate to be able to include a section from Rafi Berg's book, Red Sea Spies. Rafi Berg, of course, is the BBC Online News Middle East editor. And this book was the inspiration for the Netflix film on this topic, a remarkable story which we've mentioned beforehand. But what I want to particularly focus on is a quotation which he takes from a grandmother in a family in Ethiopia who was persuading her family that they need to take the opportunity, despite the dangers in the early 1980s, to go to the land of Israel. And this is what was said by somebody whose section of the Jewish people had been exiled not just from Israel for almost 2,000 years, but from almost any other contact with Jews. Some of them even thought that the Second Temple was still standing. Even though it was destroyed in the year 70 CE, they were that remote from the other Jewish people. And what did she say? She said, to go to Jerusalem, it's enough to have the clothes you stand up in. That was their connection of their journey. And as Rafi very kindly let us publish this, Rafi does fantastic work as the online news editor, Middle East news editor for BBC News, and does fantastic education work as well about the story of Ethiopian Jews. Rafi noted that the family on their journey decided to all leave. And let me just read to you an extract from this. People started to tell us that many people were walking to Jerusalem. This was a distant dream for us. Sometimes someone dreams all day, when the dream comes true, he doesn't believe it, and then he starts to dream again. It doesn't matter that we're leaving our homes. We're going to a better place. In fact, the best place in the world. And here is a picture of them emerging from one of the Hercules transporter planes. There's a charming story, which is on the IDF blog website, the Israel Defense blog website, which we included, again, in this Machzor that I mentioned to you, where the pilots of one of those planes hid in Holland during the war in a similar manner to Anne Frank. And thank God he and his family survived. And they came to Israel and he joined the IAF, the Chel HaAvir, Israel's Air Force, but particularly its international division, which was established to help other countries and help other people in other countries in time of crisis. And this particular pilot really wanted to, I suppose, express his gratitude for having been saved during the war by joining this particular division. And he flew one of these planes from the landing strip in Northern Africa to Israel. And the pilot set a world record for the number of Jews who were, a number of people, excuse me, who were able to fly on the plane. It was over 1,000 people were on the plane. And in fact, the number went up by one as they were flying from Ethiopia to Israel, because a baby was born on the plane at the same time. All the seats were stripped out. There were as many people as possible crowded into the plane. And he said it was an incredibly moving thing to be able to rescue these people and bring them to Israel. And in the concluding section of the extract which we took from Red Sea Spies, from Rafi's book, he notes how the people walked through the desert, and 3 months after leaving their village, they finally arrived at the camp near to Khartoum, where they would stay, from where they would leave to go to Israel, and eventually arrived in Israel on the 25th of May that year. And a child who was amongst them at the time, a 5-year-old child, became a major in the Israel Air Force, also became a pilot, wanted to give back and help other people with this particular experience. So I wanted to share some of these stories with you because I think that they illustrate the religious meaning of going to Israel, both conceptually and as a reality which so many people have taken on board and have aspired to take on board throughout the generations. For those who joined after the beginning, just to remind you that the instructions for logging your attendance are in the email which you sent, and the code for this evening is Israel. You probably guess why the code for this evening is Israel. I will repeat it again as we get a little bit closer towards the end of the broadcast. Now, I want to, as we get towards the close, share with you some wonderful thoughts which I've read from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Rabbi Lord Sachs, our former chief rabbi, on the topic of journeys to the lands of Israel. And it's in one of my favorites of his books, which is called Future Tense. And we were again fortunate to publish, be able to publish the chapter called Israel, Gateway of Hope in this particular Machzor. And we also have some extracts in this Siddur. This is the Tribe NCSY Siddur, also published with Koren Publishers, which is for teenagers. And similarly, as with the Machzor, has stories, has pictures, has questions for reflection and discussion, and I think is a wonderful tool for trying to teach the significance and the contemporary resonance of our prayers. And so we were able to publish similar extracts in this book from Rabbi Sachs's writings. So Rabbi Sachs notes that Israel, as he calls it, is a gateway of hope. A gateway of hope, not just because it's what is represented in Jewish life throughout the ages, whether the Jews were in Ethiopia or Europe or in Iran or Iraq. It was an aspiration which they never gave up on. They sung L'Shana Haba'a B'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem at the end of Yom Kippur, please God we will do in a few days' time. They sung it at the Pesach Seder. They had it in their prayers every day. It was something which they passed on from generation to generation. So Israel wasn't just a gateway of hope, but it was a place, Rabbi Sachs says, of choosing life. It was a place, as Rabbi Sachs notes, that has absorbed immigrants from 103 countries, speaking 82 languages. It's turned a desolate landscape into a place of forests and fields. It has developed some of the finest agricultural and medical techniques and created one of the world's most advanced high-tech economies. And I'd also add, particularly given Israel's recent treaties with the UAE and with Dubai, it's a place, and with Bahrain, excuse me, a place that has allowed us to dream. What do I mean? If you look carefully at those treaties, you'll see that there's something unusual and different about them, very different to the peace treaties that Israel has with Jordan or with Egypt. In the latter, there is loads of detail of maps and annexes about what happens if a tank goes in the wrong place, or there is disagreement about interpretation of a particular provision, etc. These new peace treaties are much shorter. I downloaded them to read them, having formerly had a professional interest in international law when I worked as a solicitor. These matters are of great interest to me. I read them and was surprised to see how short they were. But my greatest surprise is to see in the preamble how there was reference to not just them being called the Abraham Accords, but also to the common monotheistic faith of Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And that's what underpins that treaty, along, of course, with strategic considerations. But that underpinning is really significant, because what it tells us is, despite the respectful differences between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, there is much that unites them together. And one of the things that unites them together is their monotheistic faith. And of course, the first people to bring that into the world, returning to the beginning of our session, were Abraham and Sarah. And they spread this idea of monotheism to the world and how it would underpin a just society and a better society. And I found an incredible sense of a dream being fulfilled when international treaties in the Middle East would bring God in implicitly through the mention of Abraham, and would say that what underpins this is not just strategic considerations, but also a religious vision, which includes the land of Israel and the state of Israel, a religious vision based on the Bible for a better future. And that, I would suggest to you, is perhaps our greatest journey to come. And the whole world will be able to benefit from, please God, the blessings of the Bible, and we will be able to have the very best conceptual and physical journeys in reality to the land of Israel. So I want to wish you all well for Yom Kippur, this period, as this period of 40 days I mentioned before culminates. I wish you a safe and meaningful fast. It should be good for all of the Jewish people. Our prayers should be answered for the good. And I'd like to thank you again for joining the session this evening. Just a reminder that the code for the survey monkey to fill in is Israel. Just put Israel, please, in the code box. And next week, it'll either be in this slot myself or one of my colleagues, Penina Savory, a wonderful teacher who also contributed to the Shana Tova book with an article on the book of Jonah. And if you want to read this, you can find this online on the United Synagogue website, www.theus.org.uk. So thank you again, and have a great evening ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.